That may just mean that Drawbridge has a very good SEO because they explain and debunk all those different myths. But if we look at this panel, couldn't we have had this in 2012? You know, the idea of cross-screen advertising has been around for quite a while. So what has changed now, and why do we actually not just talk the talk, but walk the walk? So let me start with you, Shane. We've had products offering cross-screen advertising for quite a while now. We've got companies proposing solutions, companies adopting cross-screen strategies. Has it all been smoke and mirrors now?
It's a great opening question, Daniel. I think yes and no is possibly a fair answer here. So why do we find ourselves in this position where cross-screen has become so relevant so quickly? I think the answer lies in the fact that we've just seen an explosion of digitization of content and a subsequent fragmentation of consumption of that content. And I think we have to, when we talk about the sort of benefits of tracking users cross-device, we have to decouple the idea of insights that you gain from being able to do that in an effective way and actionable insights. And so what I think has happened is the sell side of the ecosystem, publishers and broadcasters in particular, have focused very heavily on trying to solve the problem holistically. And we're at a point now where they're still trying to solve that. So it's a hugely complex challenge to firstly, get your ducks in a row, to understand where your users are and what they're doing and when they're doing it. It's even more complex to plug in those insights into media activation, as it were. And so what's happened is, I think in the last 3 to 4 years, there's been a mini vacuum where the buy side has emerged yet again to fill that void with the best technology possible. And I'm sure we'll speak about the various approaches in determining how we match users cross-device, probabilistic, deterministic, and so on. But that's ultimately, I think, the way we at IPONWEB see the current sort of state of affairs.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're fortunate to have two broadcasters on the panel, so we're keen to hear from you guys. How has your cross-screen strategy evolved over the last couple of years, and where has it come to today?
Shall I start?
Yes. Well, obviously, yeah, we have a cross-screen strategy for many years, and the way we are now selling our campaigns is to display ads on a content-centric basis. So we have to be able to follow the viewers wherever he's going. So TV set obviously is still the main screen, but now with the fragmentation of audience, we have to make it possible just to address the campaigns everywhere. So we are now able to display advertising on any kind of screen. What is difficult is to monitor how we display it, and how we will manage about the frequency capping, how we will be able to have a unique ID, and how we will be able to make it sure for the advertiser that he has a very efficient way of playing the campaign. It should be possible from the publisher part, but how the agency will be able to monitor that, it's another question. So we are relying as well on the way we will be measured. On the French market, for instance, we are working with Médiamétrie very closely, and they are trying to develop a system where they could measure on the 4 different screens and to build a model when we can have the global cover for contents. But when it comes to campaign, it will be very difficult. So we have to build each broadcaster our own model, which make it possible just to display the ad on the best way on every kind of screen, but it's still a work in progress.
And for you, James, work in progress, or is it all solved now?
Yeah, absolutely work in progress. I think our cross-screen strategy has been led by the consumers. So actually for us, our principal objective is to make sure we're in front of the consumer with our content. So we've grown over the last 3 or 4 years from sort of around six platforms or devices to well over 20 now. And we're waiting for the advertising to catch up with that, really, in terms of taking full advantage. You know, the other thing to say is the way, as a broadcaster, I think we need to distinguish between broadcast or advertising around television, video advertising around television, and video advertising generally, which I think are still two quite different experiences for consumers and also different value for advertisers as well. So for me, there's two steps. One is getting advertising to sort of catch up with the cross-screen growth of broadcasting content. And the second thing is to make sure it does that without compromising the established value that TV advertising already brings.
I think it's probably inherently deeper for all of us than maybe we expected it to be a few years ago. So if you think about it in the context that actually consumers have always been ahead of where technology is, where content is, and we often run to catch up where the consumer is. So you think about the consumer moving to mobile as quickly as they did, and that was the written word and editorial pictures very quickly. And then, of course, consumers don't think about it in the way that we, as an industry, think that I'm going to go from one thing to the next, and they just expect everything to be there at the, when I get my mobile phone, which is now a smartphone, and it has a beautiful screen on it. Why can't I watch video there the same way as I have been watching video on other devices over the last kind of 5 or 6 years? So, and inherently, as you move into the mobile world and tablet world and over-the-top devices, Roku, all those, Apple TV, where video content should be available for all of the publishers' consumers, is that you walk into a world of pain because no longer does the cookie-based world exist. Or at least it doesn't work anyway. So we've then run forward to take a step back and figure out how to manage that cookieless world in what is now we're in the present future. So I think the challenge has been now for the last few years to from a technology perspective to rewind that to enable the ability to draw from the publisher and for the buy side, the ability to match that consumer wherever it goes at any given point in time. I think we've made, of course, there are some companies who have an advantage on that because logged in data allows that to happen. But that doesn't necessarily help a broadcaster that looks at a household. It doesn't necessarily look at a publisher who maybe look at, I'm now not just looking at an individual who's logged in. I want to know who's in the household. I may know the subscriber, but do I know every single person that's using that screen at that moment in time? And that's where you have to go back to deep-rooted technologies to be able to do that. I think there are a number of companies that are doing that right now. So I think going back to the question that you asked, which is, has it been myth and is it, I don't know whether you use the word smokescreen. I don't think it is. I think that the industry's just trying to find its feet along multiple steps, and it isn't. This is still a very nascent industry, and we shouldn't forget that. So finding your feet along those steps is an important part of how we get there, and I think there are a number of companies that are kind of getting there quite quickly.
You mentioned the kind of growing pains of the cross-screen world, but some companies say, well, this is actually a placebo pain. You can actually target wonderfully nice across mobile and even in a cookieless world. So would you see some companies in the technology world that are better positioned to capitalize on cross-screen targeting than others?
It's to me, yeah. So I think absolutely publishers have a huge opportunity in this environment, particularly publishers who have some kind of persistent identifier which they can leverage. And if you just imagine, in your case, Virginie, being able to target somebody across Dailymotion into ITLA and then onto some studio canal produced piece of content, that's very, very powerful. The challenge is how do you package that up? So do you sell socio-demographic segments, and then how do you get to that point?
I think the complexity, so you mentioned, Owen, determining the granularity of a set-top box, whether it's at the individual level that you're reaching the user or whether it's a more social environment. I mean, that's hugely complex, managing that in particular at runtime if we talk about programmatic channels. That's a challenge which will not be solved this year or possibly even next year. But I think the prize is very substantial for a broadcaster who manages to bridge that gap and go some way ultimately to reducing the middleware footprint along the way to the advertiser.
But is it right for broadcasters to really go solo on this? I mean, we've seen James and Virginie, you both told me you have kind of single initiatives focused around Channel 5 and around CANAL+. Are we seeing the risk that we're trying to fix cross-screen advertising, but everybody's putting their own standards and putting their own methods of doing it on it, so that we're actually fragmenting the advertising world even more than actually consolidating it?
Possibly, but I think in some ways it's an inevitable first step along the way to something that's more widely, a more wider availability of data. Because speaking about Channel 5, we, as a channel, we invest hundreds of millions of pounds in content and many millions of pounds a year in technology. What I don't want to do is jump to a place where I'm making my data available in some form or other to third parties without knowing exactly who it is, what they're going to do with it, what controls that I have over it, and frankly making sure that the investment that we've made in the content and the technology is sustainable. So in some ways, the sort of managed almost experiment that we're probably doing at the moment, where we're doing our own thing, we're creating our applications, we're doing sort of little partnerships here and there with different kinds of company, is just us getting our heads around it, feeling comfortable that we've got enough control. I think, frankly, also it's to do with making sure advertisers are comfortable and they're coming along the journey at the same speed as everybody else, and they're not being hurried into something that isn't going to provide them with value for money. But down the line, as we grow more comfortable, as we understand what the nature of the demand is going to be, and also what creative is going to work best for that demand, partnerships will sort of start to bed in, I would expect. And I would imagine the first place that would happen would be among broadcasters. So with this, obviously, either between broadcasters or together in some sort of joint venture of some sort. But I think jumping straight to that is hard because you don't actually know what you're getting into until you've kind of worked along the way a bit.
So Virginie, you mentioned you did some trial and error on this, but would you then see potentially in the future some kind of Laplace model for cross-screen advertising powered by your set-top box data?
Well, I think it's a step-by-step work in progress, because obviously the first challenge was to make our contents available on every touch point. Right now in France, I think we have like 6.5 screens on average per household. So we first had to be able to make it sure that we were displaying contents everywhere. So now we have to be able to monetize the contents everywhere. And of course, the next step would be to find a way to build a standard with the other publishers. So that, because everybody has its own app and everybody has its own corner on IPTV. And so it's very difficult to imagine right now to share information. About the set-top boxes in France, it's a huge way of consuming television through set-top boxes. So obviously we have a lot of data around it, but we would have then to make a system where we would onboard also the internet providers as well as the TV groups, and so it's a very complex model to build. So I think for the beginning we have to start with our own data and our own CRM when we have, and our own way of displaying advertising. And we also have a challenge about user experience, because cross-screen also means for people that they have to find the same user experience everywhere. And advertising has to follow in a good way on the different screens. So yeah, I do agree with you, but I think it's the first step, and we have many steps ahead, but it's very difficult to know what would be the next step.
I think to Virginie's point as well is that it's and to James's is that they work for a publisher and their first responsibility is to their board and their shareholders, right? So they're going to find a solution that fits for Channel 5 and Canal+ to start with, and every publisher will do that same thing if they become more and more there becomes more clarity around what that same thing is and can look as if it is a scalable solution for multiple publishers, whether that be a broadcaster or not, then I'm sure at certain points in time that will start to happen as a collaborative format. And I think that goes back a number of, into pretty much any media where then it becomes the fight as to who has the largest audience and who gets the largest share, and that's how the media industry has lived for the last 50 years. So I don't think that I speak to publishers day in, day out, and I don't think I blame them for thinking of that perspective. I think it's also companies like IPONWEB and YuMe and others around the room. It's part of our responsibility to try and help publishers along that journey, to provide them with some comfort that the investment that they're going to make into technologies to get them from one place to another is a good investment that goes back to that board and shareholders. There is another side to this conversation, right? So we're kind of quite a lot of one side, and there's the buy side to this conversation, which is actually has the money flow moved quite as quickly as we all had expected it to, from TV to what I would call I've heard always described as online video. I'm never quite sure what that means, because I thought that meant connected to the internet at any point in time, not by screen, and then mobile, and then tablet, and then OTT. So the reality is that when I see most buys happening from the demand side, actually they're put into an online video world, when actually the reality of that, it means to the advertiser, it means PC or laptop, and not mobile and tablet, and actually that money flow hasn't happened quite as quickly as the consumption has happened. So we need to look at this from both angles. How do we allow the demand side to actually to be able to access that content on mobile and tablet, on OTT? How do we increase the benefits of running multi-screen, so that when I see an advertising campaign for advertiser X, and they say they want it to go where their consumers are, that actually that ad gets delivered across multiple screens, rather than actually, I know that the advertiser is going to be looking at it on a laptop themselves, so therefore I'm going to deliver 80% of that campaign on a laptop. And so we have to dispel some of those things, both sides of the equation, and that's I guess that's what everyone's here for. Is to try and understand how we do that. There are some solutions, but as Virginie says, it's going to take some time for everyone to get set in the right place. But I don't think you should, to quote Henry Ford, people, before he built the first car, if he'd have asked people what they wanted, they'd have said faster horses. So I think we have to just be aware of that we don't kind of, just do what we're doing right now, but actually find some ways to get people over that hump, even if we have challenges of complete universal ID or unique ID being able to run campaigns across screen.
I think the journey to cross-screen advertising is well underway. It has been for several years, but it's the data side of it that it's a bit stuck at the moment because of the fact that cookies aren't available in between different devices.
Yeah.
I mean, we've been taking advertising across all of our screens, games console, streaming boxes, mobile, tablet, you name it, since launch. We don't launch onto a platform unless we think we can monetize it in some fashion through advertising. But I think the focus of your point is on PC and laptop, you can do programmatic, you can do, you can slice and dice the audience based on behavior, all this, that, and the other. And you can't do that on a PlayStation 3 at the moment, for example.
Yeah, echo all of your points. I think the complexity is pretty scary at times, but it's not insurmountable. I think you touched on a very good point around corporate alliances, whether there's a need for publishers to collect and defend. I think in certain cases there is.
But I very much would second your point, Virginie, around a step-by-step iterative approach to solving these issues. The complexity is just too great to sort of conceive some killer approach to solving the cross-device and the data challenge with a single sort of fell swoop. And so, we as a technology company, we see those challenges daily. Our view is that you need to take a very iterative approach, but that ultimately the system because let's not forget, if we talk about programmatic channels, the outlet for this innovation, the currency of trading there is still the cookie for display and video. And so ultimately there needs to be some kind of transformation there between what you conceive and the outside channel. And so
I also think the rules of trading and doing business around that sort of ad delivery need to settle down a bit as well.
Yeah.
It's real-time bidding and all that kind of stuff might work for certain probably relatively low overhead publishers where there's less at risk from a sort of financial perspective. Mm-hmm. In my opinion, that works less well for broadcast content. And so the way in which advertising is sold and then monetized by the publisher, I think needs to move on a little bit as well before we can start to take those next steps.
But Shane, as a company that builds technology, whom do you see approaching you with what requirements? Do publishers have different requirements for a cross-screen solution than advertisers or other tech intermediaries? Are there some common patterns, or is everyone wildly different?
There is a common pattern, and the pattern is usually a fairly lengthy conversation in the beginning, and then a sort of moment of realization that the complexity and the legacy around technology which was designed sort of 10, 15 years ago, publisher ad serving systems, which are simply not equipped to handle the activation layer, even if you've invested heavily in DMP technology, cross channel recognition, and so on. So there is a moment where, and we do speak to many publishers, there's usually a moment where the realization happens that actually, this is an endeavor which is entirely feasible in terms of building a holistic system that speaks to all legacy technology and which has a window to the outside world as well in terms of reaching the advertiser dollars and pounds. But ultimately, I think there's a misperception usually that this problem can be somehow circumnavigated with clever technology. It can't. The technology is clever, but the complexity is huge.
But can we be a bit more specific about what this complexity really is? We say the technology is there, you take an iterative approach, but where then is the complexity? Is it on the data? Is it on the measurement? Is it on the education?
If you take something simple like a frequency function, so global frequency capping across browser-based content, in-app environments for M-Rate video, and reaching a user in a set-top box. So the complexity around identifying at what stage the user is, if if some DR budget, where they are in the funnel, if it's awareness-based advertising, how do you detect that A, this is the same user, and B, this is exactly the point at which I wish to reach them. So legacy publisher ad serving systems are simply not equipped to handle that complexity today. And so there needs to be an additional layer, which to my mind doesn't really exist yet.
I don't think, I'm not a technologist, but so this is going to not go down well with you probably. I actually don't think the complexity is in the technology. It's easy for me to say that, I suppose. I think it's in the business relationships that are required in order for that data to travel between across those devices. It is about the different parties. That you've got a publisher. You might then have a separate platform operator. Then you'll have a media agency. There'll be a buy-side tech company, a sell-side tech company. There'll be the advertiser. In order for the data to be shared in a way that allows the journey of a consumer through various pieces of advertising to be tracked. You need the relationships between all those parties to work for all those parties, and that's at the moment it's a bit of a land grab, and so there's a little bit of dancing going on, I think. And it'll take a while to get there, sorry.
Because we have very strong standards on TV, and especially in data, we are working about demos, and it's, it's very standardized world. And if we compare it to the digital world, we will speak about behavioral targets. And so how do we make it possible to join everything? And then we will need the metric. If we would like to build a relevant cross-screen campaign, then we will have to build relevant metrics to make it possible to compare the TV context with any other kind of context. And for us, it's a very big challenge in France because, again, TV is a very standardized world and the TV context is very well monitored. And when it comes to digital, we have a lot of questions to ask. And what if we measure viewability? What about completion rate? And so how can we build a relevant cross-screen campaign if we don't have a relevant cross-screen metric? And of course, then comes the data. So that's why it's a step-by-step process.
I think to that point as well. So there's kind of the two largest players in measurement are Nielsen and Comscore globally. Nielsen obviously partner with Médiamétrie in France as that JV. So, but they approach things slightly differently. So Comscore look from digital within the digital world. So you go from a laptop to a mobile to a tablet, and they look at it in the digital environment, whereas Nielsen approach it from a TV world, which is TV to digital. So how does that user move from what was to Nielsen's heartland, which is TV? You get quite different answers to the question depending on which piece of data you look at, because you're in a digital world and you move from a PC to a mobile to another digital device, versus if you're moving the bigger audience, which is naturally TV, into a digital world. So I'm always nervous at the start of these kind of sessions is that we sound like doom and gloom. I don't think that's necessarily the truth at this moment in time. I think there's a lot of goodness that's happening. Nielsen have their measurement panel, which I forget the acronym at this moment in time, too many of those in the digital world. Comscore have VMM, which is their video media metrics, which at least takes a stab at allowing planners, buyers, and publishers to look at where their audience sits in the world.
They do.
It's a first stab. I'm not suggesting
it's inadequate, though.
Pardon?
It's inadequate, I think, on both fronts. Comscore doesn't extend beyond PC and mobile, and well over. If you include Sky and Virgin VOD, that's about 3/4 of our views are served away from PC and mobile. So there's sort of Comscore missing out 75% of our consumption. So that doesn't work for us. On the sort of TV coming into PC side, that's more hopeful, but it will take longer because, to Virginie's point, there's more sort of standards to work through. There's more sort of work to be done to hook up the linear audience with that VOD audience. It would take longer. I think it's inadequate on both fronts. I mean, and talking about Nielsen, I know my friends in Viacom, my parent company, they've got a big problem with Nielsen because they're not measuring half of the consumption of Viacom programming in the States. It's a big problem.
So we seem to be in this strange age, we have more data than ever, but less than ever really we know what it means and make sense of it. So it's this post-consensus world. So are we in the world of cross-screen advertising, particularly when we look at the old standards of TV, which were imperfect, everybody agreed on it? Are we risking in the future of devaluing advertising because no one can really put an exact point of measurement on your screen?
I think, James has a point. I don't disagree with that point, and I think it's relative to a broadcaster, right? But the consumption of digital video isn't necessarily just about broadcasters. We have to think of this in the wider context, especially from the buy side. The other thing I would just add is that Shane made reference to it. This is about data. This is about that first-party data, and we're all trying to get closer to that first-party data. First-party data has actually changed its definition of what it is as well a little bit. It used to be that it's publisher first-party data, but actually the buy side then said, actually, shouldn't that be what my advertiser's first-party data really looks like? They're the people who are physically going to buy the products that I want to advertise. So actually, what's the real data? Is it the publisher, therefore they know who the consumer who's watching their channels and their shows and video, whatever screen, or is it actually the data coming from the retailer or the person who's selling the product, where actually they're the people we all want. That's where the money flows, right? It goes to so you look at those two pieces and you have to solve those. We are one of those companies that invested heavily on DMP technology to try and understand that. But and we actually provide those sources back to publishers that they can use for themselves or in aggregate across other publishers. That's one way of doing it. So they get their own ability to do their own first-party data information that they can then trade on to the buy side independently. And the advertiser can use the same, use their own first-party data. Whether they make that available, it's all, it's all non-identity based information, so you're actually using real data about real people without giving away all the secrets and that obviously privacy doesn't allow. But it's connecting those two pieces of data, which is, I think, essentially the most important thing that's going to get us along this technology path, because the reality is that's where the money flow will be. If an advertiser can find their audience and a publisher knows I have the audience, in the old world it used to be TV world, right? This is my audience as measured by Médiamétrie or Barb, right? And it's a 5,000 panel. I'm not saying it's wrong. I worked for a broadcaster for many years, so it's the metric you have. So that metric means that my TV buying audience can come by it. In this world, and we're not quite there yet, but I want to know who if my customers are people who buy a certain brand of cereals in the morning, and the publisher has access to that information individually or as an aggregate, and as an aggregate, they have more of the audience that buys that brand of cereals in the morning, then the money flow will happen that way. And companies like Shane's and mine will benefit from that in the middle because of providing the connections to those audiences.
I think you touched on a really important point. So the money flow is exceptionally important in any conversation where technology plays a central role. And to your point, James, I don't disagree that something possibly needs to change in how publishers, broadcasters monetize, because today, you're getting somewhat of a raw deal still. However, you simply can't deny that billions of pounds of euros have been invested in technology, programmatic technology in particular, over the last 5-6 years, say, and ultimately, open
not
standards.
Billions of my money.
Sorry, not billions of your money. I don't disagree with that either, but. My point is, the money flow will continue to flow through those channels for the foreseeable future, and even more pertinent is the reason why. So open RTB standards, which is specifically my world, they evolved for a very specific reason. And that was to enable advertisers to reach the consumer in a much more meaningful way at a relevant point in time. Individually, and I think to sort of reverse the good work that's been done there through perhaps over zealously rethinking the business relationships that you have as a publisher is possibly a step backward.
Yeah, no, I don't know. I don't think I was suggesting that. It was more just that in order for the whole model to work, every participant needs to get a return on their investment and needs to be able to some extent, control their own destiny and at least have some levers to pull in that regard. And because of the billions that we as an industry spend on content, let alone the technology that delivers that content, we need to think harder, perhaps, than some other publishers, not all of them, but some other publishers about how we protect that. Mm-hmm. And the other side of it is that we also know that the model that we built our relationship with advertisers on thus far, the linear broadcast model, has been proven time and time again to be one of the most effective, if not the most effective, brand building model ever invented yet. Mm-hmm. And so the other thing we don't want to do is throw away that power by moving to an environment where a video ad is slapped on an interface somewhere. You don't really know what's going on with it, whether anyone can see it, whether it's a human clicking on it or a machine. whether actually that the creative that's being served is relevant and is sort of is appropriate for the content around it. You know, whether there's been a compliance process to make sure that actually there's nothing going to be there's no degradation of trust between the advertiser and the consumer, or the advertiser and the publisher. Yeah. All of those things are very important to TV, and that's what's made TV what it is. And we want to preserve the best bits of those things in the on-demand world and in the programmatic world as well.
To that point, I think so. There's a piece of study Nielsen just carried out. It's called "When Screens Collide," and it's actually one of the interesting things about that, and hopefully it gives us some comfort in the industry that we're in, is that when measured with TV and then with TV with PC or desktop, mobile, and then tablet. It didn't do connected TVs or devices like that, but the engagement with brands on TV or when multitasking, I should add that, so TV plus something else, right, is that 30% of TV ads were recognised, and still that's a big chunk, right? When TV plus PC was done, 50% of brands were recognised, but when TV plus mobile was done and tablet, 95% of brands were recognised. So mixing both, so there is no demise in TV, but mixing both digital and TV has a huge influence on how brands perform, and advertisers are very well aware of that. Yes, it's about ROI, but ROI can be measured in brand engagement as well. So and more increasingly is starting to be as well. So it's footfall to the store, it's purchase of the product, but actually, do people actually know that my brand exists, right? So I think I always like to think that the glass is half full. But I think that those, lots of the data coming out of those studies is actually pretty powerful stuff about why brands, the buy side, should equally be taking a look at how they can utilise the tools that are there right now, and force the industry to keep changing to find better tools as well. I don't think you won't get any disagreement from us, I don't think, as a panel, to say that we always want better tools, and whether that's tech companies building them, whether that's broadcasters paying for them or publishers paying for them, but it does come at a price. But just to take stock a little bit, I mean, you mentioned studies that show how ads in different combinations work best. The problem is always how the studies are actually operationalized. I mean, we see so many studies, and everybody sees, okay, yes, it makes sense to do it that way. But who's actually applying those insights? And we've so far, to take stock a little bit, we've spoken about the publisher perspective, how publishers try to kind of reassemble screens and reassemble consumers. We talked about the changes in consumption behavior. But we talked about technology. But one thing we haven't spoken about is actually culture, and particularly buying cultures. So are the agencies, or is the buy side actually set up to do cross-screen advertising, or do we still see a siloing of functions, which is actually a larger obstacle than any technology or any data targeting would fix?
From where I'm sitting, which is slightly outside the ad industry, because I focus on product and content, I think the buying culture is principally where the most margin's to be made for the agency. I think that's driving a lot of is driving the activity to quite a large degree, particularly around programmatic, where there's some really good margin to be made for an agency, and between the price you charge the advertiser and the price you sell on to the publisher, or that you buy from the publisher rather. So for me, that's feels to me around programmatic in particular. That's the culture at the moment. It's about maximising margin.
So it's not really about the screens and the best. And
I don't think so.
Consumer-centric, how to connect consumers across screens. It's a pure financial. It's a margin decision.
That's where I'm sitting. From where I'm sitting.
It's hard to answer on their behalf. There's probably more people in the audience that can give you a better opinion rather than the majority of the supply side. But I think the reality is that I think there's a little bit of that, as James mentioned, but I think there's also, it's educating clients, right? If you're an advertising agency and you're educating your client about how to spend their money, we're all humans, and it's human nature to think about, I'll spend my money where I think that fits best. And I use an old adage that we used to use at Sky many years ago, is that when the size of the satellite dish on the side of their house was nearly 2 meters wide, no CMO in the world who had mostly beautiful houses would put that satellite dish on the side of their house, and no media buyer who was based in the centre of London who had a landlord that wouldn't allow that satellite dish to appear on their roof of their rented building would actually consider Sky in the very first years that we launched. The minute that we made that dish smaller, it became a little more, and we gave them away for free. Actually, people started to recognise Sky and to spend their money there. So, and the actual reality of that was that first instance to where it became, the money flow started to happen because we did something. We changed the way that chief marketing officers and agencies thought about Sky as a brand and therefore the channels within it. We're in that same world right now. If we, if I'm, and I think that's why the money flow is starting to happen, is that if I'm now looking at content on my smartphone, and I look around at airports pretty much every given day, there now are CMOs watching the same things on their laptops, tablets, and mobile phones. Right now, they're going back to their own teams within clients and saying, why are we not spending more money on mobile? Because now I'm using it, right? Maybe it was only my kids that were using it 3 years ago, playing Angry Birds. Now it's me using it because I'm watching the BBC News or I'm watching Channel 5 or Canal+ content. That money is starting to flow because of that. It has to be part of human nature. If it's not part of human nature, then actually the money flow often doesn't change either, because the number of stats around the world can be as many as they are, is that I still probably believe first and foremost in what I believe in as an individual.
So we can clearly see it's a very complex debate, and we are running out of time, and I think we could tackle many other things. We haven't spoken about deterministic versus probabilistic approaches. We haven't talked about who is actually going to fuse those different data points from the buy and the sell side. But I think what this debate kind of has shown is that cross-device advertising is more than a buzzword. There are, it is thought of strategically by media owners. It seems to be an iterative, step-by-step approach, a trial and testing approach. There seems to be a lack of standards and a new way of fragmentation, in the sense that media owners who have premium inventory try to do it their own way. We see the value of intermediaries in the power of interpretation of data and the power of piping and of bringing disparate parts of the ecosystem together. But I think it's clearly that we could have the same debate within 5 years, and the topic of cross-screen advertising wouldn't be an old hat still. And with that, I'd like to thank the panelists very much. I don't think we have time for questions as everything is running a bit late, but please join me in thanking the panelists.